Hi everyone, this is a online recorded version of the presentation for the Welcome Building Better seminar on Thursday the 15th of October 2020. I'm Professor Stephen White. I'm from the Manchester School of Architecture. The presentation is called Architecture Starting with Difference, speaking to the subject matter of the seminar, which is about accessibility in the built environment. So my starting point is difference, and so this is about architecture and difference and how we think about difference. The three themes that I'm interested in is how we conceive of and construct identity when we think about the differences between bodies, differences in design processes and in ourselves, and that speaks to the kind of the way we think about difference and construct identity. In the second theme is really in disciplinary terms, how specifically different bodies, processes and practices are valued in the ways that we design and behave creatively and professionally as architects. And then thirdly, in political terms, how different bodies, processes and practices are differently privileged in the production of the built environment, and how the way architects think, design and behave contributes to this. So I'm going to go through those three themes in this presentation. So the first question that there's going to be a discussion about in the seminar, but in this presentation I'm going to assume we're going to start with the second one, with disciplinary terms, specifically how different bodies, process and practice are valued in the way we behave. So I'm just going to discuss what architecture means to me very briefly in order to set this out. So the different kinds of architecture. But when we look at this normally, we're normally just distinguishing between external appearance of form or cultural appeal. So broadly speaking, people who come up to me in parties say, what kind of architecture do you like? They're looking for an answer that fits into modern, traditional or classical, generally speaking. Any other answer is kind of outside the bounds of what people would expect. There are different kinds of architect as well. So we're normally assumed to be operating under patronage, and we're depicted in Hollywood films as handsome white males in their late 30s and 40s. Now, some of that is obviously true, but it's obviously it's a presumption which is based on prejudice, but the prejudice is in the way that architects access the discipline, and the fact is that it is predominantly white males in their late 30s, 40s, 50s who are prominent in the discipline and prominent in the history of the discipline. In terms of architectural processes, there are a few different kind of rationales of how architecture comes about and what it is. It's not normally discussed, the process, that's the main thing. It's normally kind of hidden in some way and assumed to be the work of an artistic genius, which might be someone like Zaha Hadid, if you know her work, or it might be someone who's more scientific and rational, but nonetheless very expert, someone like Norman Foster. But there's also a third kind of justification, which is a kind of mix between the two, which uses phenomenological approaches, and that would be another famous architect, someone like Peter Zumthor. So you get these different kinds of architects. So on this kind of fake radar diagram I've got in front of me, I'm describing kind of different practices where the boundaries of the radar diagram are elite, ethics, art and fees. So if you look at commercial practice, they're almost entirely focused on fees. They probably have some ethical boundaries because they need to comply with sustainability regulation. They're probably not that interested in artistic practices, and they're not that bothered about being considered elite. If you look at someone like Peter Zumthor, who I just mentioned, he is considered the pinnacle of architectural practice by many architects, and so is very elite. He's also very interested in art, and he has ethics about the use of materials, and but I wouldn't, based in Switzerland, doing very luxurious buildings, his ethics are kind of limited to within the disciplinary boundary. If you look at a diagram of Ai Weiwei is very, very elite, if you like, but also very, very ethical in many ways, and is entirely art-based, but does build buildings. So the approach I'm kind of putting here is in the student environment. We're talking about a kind of way of doing things which we're describing as and architecture, with an ampersand at the beginning of the word instead of the A. And we're entirely focused on ethics and art. So we're really interested in difference. So we're focused on ethics and art. And I'll come to that in a bit. So these traditional views of what architecture is, if you look at Norman Foster, what is good architecture? Well, it might be the biggest or the boldest. So I've got a picture here of Kazakhstan's capital Astana, which has got the largest tent in the world and the largest pyramid in the world, both designed by Norman Foster. It's got also, in my opinion, probably the ugliest national monument in the world in the same urban environment. But it's all about iconography and being most prominent and making an identifiable image for the place, which grew out of the steppes. Is a Peter Zumthor building mentioned before. It's in a spa in Vals in Switzerland. It's absolutely extraordinary. Its detail is complete perfection. It's totally controlled. It's an amazing place to be. It's incredibly luxurious. I went there for my 40th birthday as a treat. It is really, really amazing piece of architecture. And this is Peter Zumthor's village, which is on the other side of the valley. It's where he lives. The houses on the hill in the light wood you can see are his houses. The picture on the left is the local pub. It's very, very beautiful. The views are incredible. And Peter's brother, who lives in the village, does concerts at the spa on the other side of the hill. So this kind of good architects know that what makes a good place to live has these kind of very intimate and pleasant kind of environs, and you have a great relationship with your neighbours. So obviously not everyone can live in Vals in Switzerland with the highest number of billionaires living there on the planet, so it must be a very nice place to live. But this picture is of the largest informal market in the world in Sao Paulo. It's an incredible place. It enables the population of Sao Paulo who don't live in the luxury of normal housing, shown by the tower blocks in the background, maybe, or don't have businesses and business premises to operate from. Enables the economy to work for people who are kind of outside the formal system, and no architects were involved. But obviously, the people came together to plan this organisation and make it work. So it's very enabling. So when you start asking about what is good and does it enable people to live a good life, you start asking more questions about who is enabled and who can access the city and what role the architect is. There's a further consideration, I suppose, in terms of the discipline, which this starts to bring up, is what is the role of the architect? Is the role of the architect to create create buildings only, or is it their role to do more things in society and maybe help design services or products or even the city itself? And when you see what in this this fake radar diagram again, what are the points on the diagram that we're trying to achieve? Are we trying to be very sensitive towards discrimination? Are we trying to tackle poverty? Are we trying to tackle climate change? Or are we only concerned with kind of creativity and formal invention, which is obviously where we mostly are at the moment? But you can see on the diagram that I'm exploring what happens if you stretch that field out. So you move away from just creativity and you move away from just buildings and you include cities. You also include products, but maybe you stretch into services. So we're trying to stretch ourselves and find out where we can make the most benefit. But your definition of good architecture, therefore, really depends where we draw these boundaries. Architecture can expand into this field And the and architecture approach kind of says that we are the field. This field of creativity is open to us to determine in some way. So these questions start coming out when you look at the differences in different kinds of architecture and practice and different users. So you start asking, what's the content of the architecture? What's not just the form? Who is it for? What does it enable? What resources does it consume? And then on a personal level, we ask, what kinds of architect can we be? How can we use our creative practices to make better worlds? And then the third kind of aspect to this, which I'll come to later, is what kinds of design process enable different practices. This maybe isn't obvious to people who aren't in design professions, but the way that you design, the techniques you use have a great influence on what kind of outcomes you create. And that's also another aspect where we have to be very careful to make sure that we don't embed presumptions about users, for example. So the next kind of question is, how do we start with difference? So this is really just to outline the way that we're thinking about it, and the way that we're framing out the way that we think about design and difference. So my work is influenced by Gilles Deleuze, and particularly his interpretation of Spinoza. And Deleuze's work, really, the starting point of Deleuze's work is to see if we can start with difference, if we can undertake this Copernican revolution and begin with difference rather than identity. And the reason that he argues that that's important is that he argues that the way that we construct and the way that we think generally is based on a kind of common sense agreement between all of our faculties, which always have something in mind that we're comparing to, either in terms of it being the same, similar, judged in opposition and analogous, or in some way kind of derived from those other judgments by a kind of dialectical process. But nonetheless, the background to that is we're starting with identity, and he asks what happens if we start with difference. And he uses Spinoza to kind of frame how we might go about thinking this through. And I suppose the fundamental point is that the common sense is kind of against difference, in the sense that Spinoza, for Deleuze anyway, replaces morality with ethics. So he moves away from good evil to this kind of this rigorous kind of approach of trying to understand what is good, bad, and this means that the kind of judgments about good and bad have to be continually made and negotiated, rather than relying on some kind of moral principle to make your judgments for you. You have to continually negotiate and work it through. And the way that this is kind of worked through in Spinoza, by Spinoza and Deleuze, is using the kind of concept of effect and the composition of effect that bodies are made of. So trying to understand what's good and bad kind of it's a judgment about how bodies are affected, but then to understand how multiple bodies are affected, you have to make a larger body that is able to kind of consider that holistically, literally holistically as a whole. So this leads on to kind of, I suppose, the most simple way of thinking about it, which I kind of use sometimes, is a kind of how do you construct a win-win game, or if you know the prisoner's dilemma game, where if both people collaborate, they get a slightly lower prize than they would if they were ruthlessly self-interested, but it adds up in the long run to the benefit of both. So it's a win-win, but it involves kind of trust and cooperation. But the difficulty, obviously, when you get to the level of a kind of city, for example, is that we don't even know what the win-wins are. It's very hard to identify them or create them, if you like. And then if you do create them, how do you share that information and persuade people that it is better for them? How do they choose it? And how can we make Spinoza would probably frame it, how can we make these winning choices the greater part of our existence? That's how we get a better life, where we have most of our affections, our affections are kind of positive. And this is maybe where the kind of creative angle comes in, where this field of creativity that architecture can contribute to is kind of, it's trying to make these win-wins. So in terms of our architectural education, I've kind of outlined what the main themes are, I suppose. But these translate, if you like, into principles that we try and communicate to the students, and we try and practice in the studio where creative activity happens. And the first one is that we see this kind of process of creative difference as the foundation of an ethical architectural discipline. And this is kind of taking our lead from Spinoza, but we really see these kind of negotiation and win-wins as the role, the non-representational effective role of the discipline is to kind of enable these relationships and to try and release potential through creative activity that wasn't there, potential for win-wins or better outcomes or more positive conditions for people. So we use creative processes as our ethical instruments, but this is because in a creative process, and this is probably maybe technical for people who aren't involved in design disciplines, creative processes are not spoken about very much. They're not made explicit, and the role of difference in them is not a common discussion, because mostly people are trying to support the delusion that they're either entirely rational, as I mentioned before, or they're geniuses which have there's absolutely no rational justification for why they're able to produce what they do. So the idea that the design process is an iterative process that relies on engagement with others and the creation of difference is a difficult sell within the discipline. So often difference is seen as error or a mistake in the creative process, whereas we're really clear that actually the differential, the creative of the new, and this kind of engagement is actually where things happen and where new things are created and potentials released. So in order to try and get there, we begin with difference as a strategy to avoid our implicit presumptions. So we literally try to use unfamiliar techniques, engage with people whom we've not met before and are unfamiliar, and put ourselves in situations and circumstances which challenge our presumptions. In terms of how we address, the differences that we've talked about and what presumptions we're trying to challenge, we've got, we're trying to deal with intersectional experience. So we're trying to deal with these kind of three aspects, I suppose, which are catch-alls for many, many sub intersectional experiences themselves. But broadly speaking, identity, ability, and advantage, and we explicitly engage the students with these kind of with literature around these different areas, and particular first-hand accounts as well as academic accounts. I won't go into that right now. So this is an example of a student who is using unfamiliar techniques, animation, and is keeping a diary, and they ended up doing a project which addressed mental health for cancer patients and clients in hospital, but really also try to maintain the humanity of the student by addressing how their own mental health was affected by the design process and how they could manage that so that they maintained a good mental health. This student, although it maybe doesn't look at it from this image particularly, engaged very directly with different kind of filmmaking techniques to understand different ways of perceiving space and being challenged by sounds and images on the basis of trying to create a design process that would work for people with autism. And this is just a kind of characteristic example of some of the solutions that a process kind of developed in different scenarios. This student looked at kind of political scene and interacted with Instagram and other social media to try and understand what kind of experience people in different filter bubbles get of public space and how the virtual impinges on the physical use of space. Yeah, so it's kind of got that political dimension. This one speaks to that design process idea again, where this student took a very famous building, the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe, which is the height of rational architectural excellence. And if you're not familiar with it, check it out. It's a very beautiful object. It's entirely controlled. Every tiny bit of it is perfect. And it's the height of kind of rational translation to a physical object, and it's much admired by architects who try and achieve that level of perfection in their outcome. This student built a series of machines that made it impossible for her to copy that building accurately, and deliberately introduced error into the process. And through that, she tried to create something which was more engaging and interesting, and demonstrate that there were lots of different ways of introducing error, which was creative. And it was only through introducing difference into the process that led to the creation of ideas and the interpretation between the architect and their work. This was a student, Nalia, who was using an unfamiliar method. She started by making a film using Francis Alice's artist method, and copying a film which involved moving water from the Red Sea to the Black Sea. She got her mother to move some water from one body of water to another, which turned out to be on the green line, across the green line of the Turkish Cypriot border. What was hilarious here, if you read the text, is that Nalia thought that she was making a film, and she thought she was just copying the film, and she got her mum to do it. But then when we spoke to her about it, she realised that actually she was kind of using instruction-based art, because she was getting her mum to do the things that she couldn't do because she wasn't in Cyprus. And she kind of was forcing her mum to do it by telling her mum how disapproving her tutors, i.e. me, would be if she didn't complete the task. And her mum tried to get out of it, because her mum nearly got arrested by the military police, and her mum wanted to look good in the video while she was doing the task, and she tried to spoof her daughter, basically, to do it, and Nalia made her do it. But what it ended up revealing and creating was a series of relationships that were questioning the border, and ending up in conversations about what the border experience was. And she went on to do some exhibitions and things in Cyprus, in houses of friends, remotely, using these kind of techniques. So it started to really engage with the territory. A really much broader picture is that over the years, students have engaged with hundreds of different groups of people as part of our projects directly. This is a slightly different take we've got on it now, but this is something that has kind of just been part of the process. We ask the students to be, take this personal engagement on, and they contribute to our professional projects by either future scoping, or getting direct commissions on occasion, or doing pro bono work for the groups that we work with, or doing specific tasks which support us, or doing stuff in parallel which augments what we do. So in summary, the pedagogy looks at these kind of unusual methods to make sure our assumptions are explicit, and we're clear about who we are and are not addressing and including. We ask it to be effective, emotionally involved, and directly engaged, so that we do not rely on our intellectual representations. And we ask the students to think about what it means to be a citizen as the first point, and then bring that power to the discipline. So how does this relate to enabling people to access the cities? I'm just going to very quickly talk about one project that we've done professionally. So we've been involved in age-friendly cities in Greater Manchester and Manchester City for about 15 years. And the whole point of the age-friendly city approach is to try and make the city more accessible for older people and as for everybody as they grow older. So the World Health Organization kind of flower has these 8 domains, and these 8 domains are transport, housing, social inclusion, health, civic participation, etc. And the point is that these multiple determinants of health impact on the experience of an individual older person who's at the center of this flower, if you like, and they all interact to influence that person's experience of the city and whether they have a bad or good experience. So in terms of what we've been talking about, for us, this has 3 kind of principles which we've tried to kind of influence at the policy level, and we've helped write the policy of the Greater Manchester Combined Authority in this area. And the first principle is that everyone has the power to change things, so there has to be a kind of accountability for the kind of decisions that happen. The second one is that we need to try to understand the complexity, so multiple determinants of health and the interaction between them. How do we kind of try to understand what the win-win is in a complex urban environment? And the third principle is that we have to work together and include everyone, because if we're going to find out what the win-win is, we need to negotiate it directly to find out what the effect on people of different things are and what effects they desire to experience. So you can't negotiate a win-win for everyone without including everybody. So those are the kind of principles. To put it in terms of kind of more obvious accessibility kind of discussions, there's a traditional medical model, there's a social model, and we would call this the kind of citizenship model, or in kind of Spinoza's terms, a capability model maybe is more appropriate. This is from the City Council from 2013 when we started. We've been working with them for a while, and so moving away from the patient, which would be the more medical model, to a social model, which maybe is more like a customer. The terms are very loaded, aren't they? But really clearly to the citizen city model, which is about place and specificity. And so we're moving away from kind of general representations of people, which are kind of intellectual, common sense and typological, to things where it's based on the specific experience of people. And this is what we mean by kind of place-based stuff. So we're trying to locate things so that they are specific, so that the questions aren't intellectual, but more embodied. So specific here means more embodied because it's located in its particular relationships, particular people in space and time. That was an animation I didn't know was on that slide. So this is something that has been taken up through working at age-friendly neighbourhoods level and doing some work on partnerships. And the idea of the partnership is that it addresses all of these different determinants of health, and there are people there as residents, and it's mixed. It's a network partnership so that it's able to kind of address the common problems and try and negotiate the win-win at a local level. And what we've been working on is how that can be rolled out across the whole of the Greater Manchester region, and it's part of the strategic priorities. But obviously, there are huge kind of barriers to making this work. But progress has been made over the last 15 years, and it's an explicit part of the policy. So a neighbour partnership kind of gets built up by things that people in this room will be familiar with: large-scale engagement events, lots of events and engagements besides. And we explicitly used the C2 kind of approach or an inspiration as we undertook these kind of partnerships kind of 10 or so, 8-9 years ago, when the first one we made, and we asked these questions. And so that first one, everyone has the power. We're trying to, everyone has the power to change it. So that's the approach. We're trying to do that at the policy level. And then the next thing that we have to do, and I think we have to do this as an academic community, it's not just about architects, but it is really trying to understand the complexity of the situation. These graphs are two large data set analysis of the Understandings of Society survey for over 50s, and what we've done is we've used a small space analysis technique to try and see what the clustering of the variables are, and it seems quite clear that older people are much more likely to want to stay in their neighbourhood if they have a closer set of relationships. If if there's no correlation in the data set between their answers for any of these questions about their neighbourhood, there kind of doesn't seem to be any connection. So we're working on how we can interpret that. But you prefer to move because the relationships in your neighbourhood are bad. You prefer to stay because the relationship in your neighbourhood are good, and the data seems to bear that out. At this place-based level, looking at the data about where people live and where the services are and what they can get access to specifically. But the process of kind of arriving at that is about working together. So bringing that information together with everybody that was in the room in the first slides to try and arrive at some kind of negotiated win-win strategic plan, if you like, for the local neighbourhood. And there's all sorts of different things that we've done to try and make that happen. And you end up with kind of local plans which are kind of age friendly in the sense that they're kind of trying to meet the needs of people that haven't had their needs met or represented in any way. And this is an urban navigation plan for Old Moat in South Manchester, which was directly created with older people, and this physical improvements to the physical environment have happened here to make the area more navigable, safer to walk, and to engage with social points and relate to the bus transport network, etc. So there's kind of pavements, access, walking safely. There's two examples here of local partnerships spending money that they got through the funding processes to make an existing facility really accessible, which was not being used for events because it didn't have an accessible toilet, even though it was in the place where the poorest, oldest, with the least access to transport and medical services lived. And when the local leisure centre was closed down for a year while it was being refurbished, that partnership got a bus from one of the local community groups that weren't using it, and they ran a bus service to the shops and to the leisure centre that was slightly further away for those residents. And this is physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, and also digital infrastructure increasingly. So we've created a piece of software that enabled everyone in the local area to know what was going on. And it's very specific. So it's called PlayScale because it's actually about the very local events that are going on that we discovered nobody knew about and weren't advertised anywhere. And this system enables people to get them online very easily. So the lastly was just to kind of, as a way of segueing out of that, was trying to just answer the question, what's it look like now, I suppose. And as we speak, our students are just exploring what the impact of COVID, the differential impact of COVID on where they live. Our students from all around the world, and we're asking them to kind of engage where they live with who's been kind of most badly affected by COVID, or where the differences are greatest between those who have managed to do okay and those who have been worst affected. So we'll just leave it there.